Good afternoon, everybody. And I will have to start off by saying I don't know, I haven't cried yet, so I don't know what might trigger it. And I'm still a bit numb over what happened last night. George mentioned that I was a staff person to Senator Edward Kennedy. So one of the reflections I bring to this period was being in Washington when Ronald Reagan took office, and I think that's maybe the closest approximation to what we're about to experience that I can come up with. And so this conversation takes place in a time of tremendous turmoil at the federal level. We don't know what kinds of policies we're going to experience, but that has been one of the things that very much impacted the course of history of Atlanta. That we do have to operate within the context of federal policy that in the beginning, in the early 60s, was much more favorable to cities, was much more favorable to the aspirations of African Americans and other diverse groups. And one of the things that has impacted this trajectory has been, in particular, the changes that took place with the Reagan Supreme Court appointees and Reagan's policy towards the cities, which was to stop giving money directly to cities and to give it to the states. So part of the reason for this book was that we have a very special city, and we do have a city that allows the kind of thriving that many African Americans experience in this city that is perhaps unequaled anyplace else. But we need to understand the ingredients that have gone into creating that soup. That we have had a very sophisticated and very strategic African American leadership that has its foundations in Atlanta University. And because of that heritage, going back over a century, we have had a very deliberate, very strategic, and very sophisticated African American leadership that has continually worked to advance the cause of African Americans and the cause of equality. That leadership produced Martin Luther King. Those institutions produced a Martin Luther King who then affected not only the United States but the world in terms of a vision of a beloved community, a vision of what equality is supposed to look like, a vision of what the United States is supposed to stand for in terms of the vision of our the structure of our founders. And so this project was done with the intent of giving this generation some background on what have been the norms in the making of modern Atlanta. This notion of a biracial coalition is something that is special in Atlanta. I'm glad to see that Sam Williams is here. In Atlanta, Sam was president of the Chamber of Commerce and counts as his mentors African American leaders like Jesse Hill and Herman Russell. There are not many communities where that is true, where senior white leaders have looked to senior black leaders as sources of inspiration. And so we wanted to tell these stories. What has the joint venture, and we'll get into the different, some of the more specifics of each era. But so I'll just leave it with talking about the book, the ballot, and the buck. That when I came to Atlanta, Atlanta was a segregated city. And I don't know if I can get any of these up. Can you get that? So this was Atlanta when I came, black and white, literally. A very provincial southern city. When I came and integrated in elementary school, I could go to school with white kids, but I couldn't go to the varsity with them. I couldn't go to Lake Lanier on the weekends with them because it was still a segregated community. And so we have to remember, because some of the continuing discontent in this country is a nostalgia for that era, where black and white were separate, where African Americans had a place and for the most part had to stay in it. And so there is a nostalgia for that among some Americans. We can go on. And so we had a sophisticated African American community, a restless student community that protested those arrangements. But in Atlanta, the protests were not met with the violence that we're seeing other places. It was met with negotiated settlements. And so that has been one of the hallmarks of Atlanta, is where there has been conflict, there has been the ability to discuss that conflict and to negotiate. And so in many instances we might say, well, it's not enough, but people don't invest in communities where there's a lot of violence. And so that has been, one of the interests of the African American community has been to create more economic opportunity. So we started with the book, our educational institutions. We moved on to the buck. How do we create more jobs, and use of the ballot also to reinforce both those things, the access to education and the access to more economic opportunity. Okay, let's go on. Of course, Martin Luther King, but one of the important things about this photograph is that it's not only Martin Luther King and the political activist and the social activists, but also Herman Russell, who was a business person. And the presence of a thriving African American business community on Auburn Avenue is, again, one of the things that was an outgrowth of our educational system and continue to make a difference in terms of the transformation of the city. And of course, we'll end with, the Olympic Games. One of the things, again, about this, the diversity of the people who work together to bring the Olympic Games to Atlanta, because you couldn't bring the Olympic Games to a segregated city. You can't have strong economic growth in a community that has segregation and discrimination as its touch point. And so that has been some of what Atlanta has used to grow, and I think we'll be going through different segments in more detail. Thank you.